Monster Hunter Rise is one of the most user-friendly Monster Hunter games out there, but if you want to take on the toughest content effectively, you're going to need a build fit for taking on the deadly monsters. So I'm Darcblade with some awesome builds for the dual blades in Monster Hunter Rise. Now these are builds and sets that I personally like to use in the game. They may not be the most meta out there, but they are aimed at taking on the majority of hunts that Monster Hunter Rise has to offer. For this series, I'll be featuring between 3 and 4 builds for each of the various weapons in the game, which should cater to a variety of play styles. When it comes to the dual blades, they are an excellent DPS weapon, and whilst the individual strikes and hits of the dual blades aren't exactly very high, the long and exceedingly fast combos allow you to quickly rack up the damage. The builds I use for these weapons are mostly DPS ones, capitalising on either elemental damage, high affinity, raw attack and more. So the first dual blade build is the Affinity Dps Build. This build is all about having high affinity and raw attack. So this means that we can take it against any monster and not have to worry about their elemental resistances, and it's also coupled with a few quality of life skills. So for this build you'll need the Kaiser Crown, the Almudron Mail S, Valstrax Braces, Anjanath Coil S and the Hunter's Greaves S. I'm also using an Absolute Petalace, although the Petalaces are down to personal preference, and when it comes to the Talisman, these are kind of down to RNG unfortunately. The talisman I'm using here has an attack boost level 3 and a tier 1 decoration slot. As for my weapons, I'm using the Night Wings, which have an attack boost rampage skill attached to them. So when it comes to the decorations, I've gone for Tenderizer Jaws to max out weakness exploit, Steadfast Jaws which are optional, but these are a personal favourite of mine that give us the maxed out stun resistance skill, Critical Jaws to max out crit boost, Grinded Jaws for some points in the speed sharpening, a Razor Jaw to max out Razor Sharp, and Brace Jaw for a point in the flinch free skill. So if you've done what I've done here, you'll have a build with a 242 raw attack rating with no element. You'll have white sharpness with 55% affinity, which can easily be 100% when you take into account weakness exploit as well. You have a decent defense of 459 that is strong against fire and thunder, but unfortunately slightly weak to the other elements. As for the switch skills, when it comes to the dual blades, pretty much any build regardless of what you're using is down to personal preference. So when it comes to the skills, first of all you have attack boost at level 7. Attack boost is a skill that grants us increased raw attack, and at level 4 or above also gives an attack increase percentage bonus on top of the actual raw attack increase itself. You'll also have critical eye at level 3, increasing the base affinity of this build. You have Critical Boost level 3. Critical Boost is a skill that when our attacks crit a monster, they'll deal increased raw attack. And as this build has very high raw attack, Crit Boost greatly benefits it. You also have Weakness Exploit at level 3. Weakness Exploit is a skill that grants us increased affinity so long as we're attacking monster weak points. Weakness Exploit at level 3 can potentially provide us a bonus 50% extra affinity. You also have Razor Sharp at level 3. Now Razor Sharp is a result of the decorations we're using as well as the Almudron chest piece. Now most people would probably prefer to use Master's Touch, especially as we have that 100% affinity so long as we're attacking monster weak points. But for this build I went with Razor Sharp instead. Razor Sharp basically gives us a 50% chance at not losing any sharpness whatsoever, regardless of if we've crit a monster or not. So this means that this build is very useful when we're going up against monsters that don't have the greatest hit zones. So we're able to still keep that white sharpness for long periods of time, even if the hit zones aren't the most favourable. Of course, if you always wanted to, you could swap out the chest piece or the decoration itself for the Master's Touch skill instead. The choice is always up to you. Anyway, you also have stun resistance at level 3, preventing any stun effects on our hunters. You also have speed sharpening at level 2. Speed sharpening is a skill that increases how quickly we can sharpen our weapon. So if Razor Sharp doesn't activate that often, we have a backup in speed sharpening. You also have Power Prolonger level 1, a byproduct of the Almudron chest we're wearing, which slightly boosts the durations that our dual blades remain powered up. So basically it increases how long we can stay in Arch Demon mode and so on. You also have Flinch Free at level 1, preventing minor knockbacks from monsters and especially our allies. And finally you have Dragonheart at level 1. Dragonheart at level 1 is a buff that kicks in when our health reaches 50% or lower. When this happens we'll contract Dragon Blight, but as a result we'll also have all our elemental resistances increased by 30. So there you have it. As you can see, it is a pretty straightforward DPS build. Having very high raw attack coupled with high affinity, it means that we can take down monsters quite quickly. However, there are pros and cons to every build. The biggest pro for this build is its strong damage output. As I mentioned, having a large raw attack combined with 100% affinity and crit boost means that we can take down monsters effectively and efficiently. On top of that, the next pro is that this build has reduced sharpness loss. This is all thanks to the Razor Sharp skill, which we mentioned already. Of course, like I said, you could swap out the Razor Sharp jewels as well as the chest piece that has the Razor Sharp skill on for Master's Touch instead. I'd recommend using the Vike chest armor if you wanted to do so. But like I said, I've gone for Razor Sharp instead, as a lot of the endgame monsters don't have exactly favourable hit zones. And the final pro for this build is it can be used against pretty much any monster in the game thanks to it being a raw attack build, meaning that we don't have to take into consideration monster weaknesses to elements and ailments. But unfortunately, there are cons to this build. One of the biggest cons is, unfortunately, you need a decent talisman for this build to work. And the other con for this build is, unfortunately, this build lacks stamina-based skills. The Dual Blades is a stamina-reliant weapon, so having stamina management skills is normally recommended. However, given the Petalace system in Monster Hunter Rise, we only have to spend a little bit of extra time picking up some Spirit Birds to increase our stamina, which kind of eliminates the need to heavily invest in stamina-based skills. So there we have it, that is the Affinity-based build for the Dual Blades. As you can see, it's a all-round straightforward DPS build, able to take on any monster in the game, regardless of resistances, and on top of that it has a few extra quality of life skills and more, making it a very decent all-round Dual Blade build. Which brings us on to the next build, which is the Elemental DPS Dual Blade build. Now this build is all about combining raw attack with elemental attack. The Dual Blades is one of the weapons that strongly benefit from using elemental weapons, and although elemental builds aren't the strongest in Monster Hunter Rise currently at the time of this video, the Dual Blades are able to use elements quite effectively. So for this build you'll need the Kaiser Crown, the Naga Kuga Mail S, Rathalos Braces S, Anjanath Coil S, and Golden Hakama. For the Petalace I'm using the Underworld Petalace, and for my talisman I'm using a talisman that has Evade Window at level 3, Muck Resistance at level 1, a tier 3 decoration slot, and a tier 1 decoration slot. For my weapons, as these are elemental builds, they can use an assortment of different weapons, one for each element. The only requirement is that you use a weapon that has a tier 2 decoration slot in it for this build to fully work. If you were using water weapons, I'd recommend the Mud Twister, which is the Almadron Dual Blades. If you were using thunder, I'd recommend the Despot Splits, which is the Zenoga Dual Blades. For fire, I'd recommend the Daybreak Daggers, which is the Aknasom Dual Blades. An alternative would be the Wyvern Lovers, which is the Rathalos Dual Blades, but unfortunately they don't have the decoration slot on. For the Ice Dual Blades, I recommend Dahora's Hook, which are the Kushala Daora Dual Blades. And then finally for the Dragon Dual Blades, which are the ones we are using, I'd recommend the Red Nort's Dragon Wing, which are the Valstrax Dual Blades. These have a Wyvern Exploit Rampage skill attached to them. So when it comes to the decorations, first of all I've taken an Invasion Jewel to max out Evade Window. I've then taken Dragon Jewels to max out the Dragon attack of this build. Of course, if you were using one of the different elemental weapons I mentioned already, you would replace the Dragon Jewels to match whatever new element you were using. I've then gone for Tenderizer Jewels for Weakness Exploit and Grinder Jewels for Speed Sharpening. So if you've done what I've done here, you have a build with 200 Raw Attack, with 46 Dragon Rating. Of course, if you were using a different weapon, it wouldn't be Dragon. You also have White Sharpness. The White Sharpness can be potentially blue if you're using some of the other weapons, with a base affinity of 25%, which can be 75% when you take into account Weakness Exploit. As for your defense, you have a decent defense of 457, that is exceedingly strong against fire, but unfortunately slightly weak to the other elements. As for the skills, you have Critical Eye at level 5, Dragon Attack at level 5. Dragon Attack is a skill that increases the dragon rating and thus dragon damage of this build. Remember though, if you were using a different weapon with a different element, you would replace Dragon Attack to match whatever new element you were using. So say if you were using the Zenoga Dual Blades, you'd replace the Dragon Attack with Thunder Attack. You also have Evade Window at level 5, a useful defensive and quality of life skill. Evade Window greatly increases the invincibility frames when we perform dodges and such. This benefits the Dual Blades as these weapons allow the hunter to move fast and quickly dash about the battlefield. This basically keeps us from potentially getting hit more often. You also have Attack Boost at level 4, Critical Boost at level 4. Like I said in the last build, Critical Boost increases our damage when our hits crit a monster, but it only applies to the raw portion of an attack, not the elemental portion. You also have Weakness Exploit at level 3, Speed Sharpening at level 3, Latent Power at level 1. Latent Power is a byproduct of the armor we're wearing, but it's still a useful buff. Whenever we have been fighting a monster for a set amount of time, or taken a certain amount of damage from that said monster, Latent Power will kick in, granting us increased affinity, and on top of that, reduced stamina depletion. And then finally, as a result of the talismans, we have muck resistance level 1, which reduces limits on our movement speed, like when we're moving through mud and such. So as you can see, this is a little bit of an all-round elemental build, able to use pretty much any of the elemental weapons in the game. On top of that, it's also quite an all-round build. But even with being an all-round build, there are pros and cons to everyone out there. The biggest pro for this build is its combination of having decent raw attack and elemental attack, which grants us a strong DPS overall, so long as we're taking into account the monster's elemental weakness. On top of that, this build has decent defensive skills, especially when we take into account Evade Window. Evade Window allows us to quickly dodge around the battlefield with little fear of being hit, so long as we have stamina to perform those said dodges. And finally for the pros is that this build, you can easily switch between weapons and thus have different elemental builds so long as you swap out the weapon and the matching jewels. But of course there are cons to every build. One of the possible cons for this build, depending on which weapon you decide to use, is that there are sharpness issues at times, as you can easily burn through your white or blue sharpness. And the other con is, unfortunately, this build has very little in the way of stamina management skills, but can be alleviated thanks to using certain petalaces, farming those spirit birds, as well as making use of dash juice. So there we have it, that is the elemental build I'd recommend for the dual blades. Like I said, it's a strong all-round build, having DPS options, quality of life and defensive options. Able to take on pretty much any monster so long as you switch your weapon to match whatever monster you're going up against. And for me, this is one of my favourites, and I'll strongly recommend it for dual blade players out there. Which brings us on to the next build, which is the Dragonheart dual blade build. Now this build is all about raw attack. Thanks to utilising the Valstrax armor set coupled with Resentment and Resuscitate, we're able to get very high raw attack, at least for the dual blades, which makes this a build that once again can be used against any monster. So for this you'll need the entire Valstrax armor set, which includes the Valstrax helm, mail, braces, coil and greaves. Once again I'm using the absolute petalace, and for my talisman I'm using a talisman that has Resentment level 2, Wirebug Whisperer level 1 and then a tier 3 decoration slot. As for my weapons, again I'm using the Night Wings, which is the Nagakuga dual blades that have an attack boost rampage skill attached to them. As for the decorations, I've gone for mastery decorations to max out Master's Touch, crit jewels for crit boost, steadfast jewels for stun resistance, and finally an expert jewel for an extra point in critical eye. I would recommend as well, if you're playing with a group, to maybe take away one of the steadfast jewels so you have a point in flinch free by using a brace jewel, but the choice is always down to you. So if you've done what I've done here, you'll have a build with a raw attack of 213. Now this may seem quite low for a raw attack build, but you have to take into consideration the buffs you get from Dragonheart, Resentment and Resuscitate, which we'll talk about when we get to the skills. You'll also have no element with white sharpness, and you'll have 45% base affinity, which can be 95 when you take into account weakness exploit. You'll also have a very strong defense of 531 that is exceedingly strong against dragon, but unfortunately weak to the other elements unless we have Dragonheart in effect. So when it comes to the skills, you'll have Resentment at level 5. Resentment is a skill that whenever we have a portion of red health on our health bar, we'll gain increased raw attack. And this works in unison with the next skill, which is Dragonheart at level 5. Now Dragonheart at level 5 is slightly different from what we talked about in the first build with Dragonheart at level 1. At level 5, when our health reaches 80% or lower, we'll contract Dragon Blight. When this happens, this will increase all our elemental resistances by 50, and on top of that, it will increase our raw attack power by 10%. And this again works in unison with the next skill, which is Resuscitate, level 3. Resuscitate basically grants us 20 extra raw attack whenever we have a blight or ailment on our hunter, so this will activate thanks to the Dragon Blight that Dragonheart puts on us. So Resuscitate combined with Resentment combined with the percentage increase that Dragonheart provides us will grant us almost an extra 50 raw attack. This damage will also be increased by the next skill, which is Critical Boost, which we talked about in the first and second builds. You'll also have Weakness Exploit at level 3, you'll have Master's Touch at level 3, which is a skill that prevents our weapon from losing sharpness during critical hits. Master's Touch at level 3 gives us an 80% chance that this will occur, and as we have 95% affinity so long as we're going for weak points, this should reduce our overall sharpness loss with this build. You also have Stun Resistance at level 3, Critical Eye at level 1, and then finally Wirebug Whisperer at level 1, which is a byproduct of our talisman. This basically improves our handling when it comes to wirebugs, which extends the durations that we can keep additional wirebugs by 30%. So there we have it, that is the Dragonheart dual blade build. Like I said, this is a raw attack DPS build, but its full potential is locked behind meeting certain requirements when it comes to the skills. So its biggest pro is its strong damage output. Its raw attack combined with the affinity based skills we have on this build means that we're able to take down monsters quickly. On top of that, this build can be used against pretty much any monster in the game, thanks to it being a raw build, so we don't have to take into account their elemental or element resistances. And on top of that, the final pro is that this build has reduced stamina loss thanks to having the high affinity combined with Master's Touch. But unfortunately, there are cons. As I just mentioned, one of the biggest cons is that its true potential is locked behind meeting certain requirements, for example activating Dragonheart and Resentment, which ultimately can leave our hunter at risk because we have to lower our health. And the other con for this build is, once again, this build has no stamina management skills, but like I said, it can be alleviated with certain petalaces as well as dash juice. So if you're looking for a build that has a little bit of a risk reward factor to it, but can be used against any monster in the game, I strongly recommend using this Dragonheart dual blade build. Which brings us on to the fourth and final build, which is the budget dual blade build. Now when it comes to budget builds in this series, they're made entirely of one armor set. There's no mixing and matching. Most of the full armor sets in the game do benefit a certain weapon or playstyle, and that is what these builds are all about. Budget builds are also designed to help hunters get through the main story of Monster Hunter Rise and get them to the point where they can start farming endgame. So when it comes to the dual blades, we're going to be making use of the full Zinogre armor set. This gives us amazing stamina management and DPS potential so long as we meet certain requirements. So for this build you'll need the entire Zinogre armor set, which includes the Zinogre Helm S, Mail S, Braces S, Coil S and Greaves S. Again, I'm using the Underworld Petalace, and for my talisman, I've gone with a talisman that has Weakness Exploit at level 1, a tier 2 decoration slot and a tier 1 decoration slot. I haven't used my rarest talismans here, as these builds are supposed to be budget builds, so players may not have access to the rarest ones in the game. And for my weapon I'm using the Tigrex Claws. These have an Affinity Rampage skill attached to them. Of course when it comes to decorations you may not have some that are shown here, as they may be very endgame, but you can still strive to get them if you so wish. I've gone for Grinder Jaws to max out Speed Sharpener, Critical Jaws to max out Crit Boost, and Steadfast Jaws to max out Stun Resistance. Critical Jaws are going to be the hardest to get here, so if you don't have them you can replace them with something else if you so wish. Attack Jaws or Expert Jaws I'd recommend with this build. So if you've done what I've done here, you'll have a build with 245 raw attack with no element, you have white sharpness with minus 14% base affinity. Even though this is negative affinity, this is normally countered to the point where it should be 86% affinity, thanks to the buff from Latent Power as well as Weakness Exploit, and you'll have a decent defense of 441 that is exceedingly strong against Thunder, fairly strong against Dragon and Fire, but unfortunately weak to Water and especially Ice. So when it comes to the skills, first of all you have Latent Power at level 5, which like I said is a buff that kicks in whenever we've been fighting a monster for a set amount of time. And as we can normally farm Spirit Birds on our way to a monster, this kills time to the point where Latent Power activates quite soon after actually engaging the monster. Alternatively, should we take enough damage from a monster, that will also activate the buff. When this happens, it will grant us 50% increase to our affinity, as well as reduce our stamina depletion by 50% as well, so we can stay in demon mode for longer periods. This is one of the key skills for this build. You also have Critical Boost at level 3. Remember, if you don't have Critical Jaws, this would be replaced by something else. You have Weakness Exploit at level 3, Constitution at level 3, which is a byproduct of the armor we're using, but it's still useful. Basically, it reduces stamina depletion by 30% when we perform moves that consume stamina. So this doesn't apply to Demon mode, but applies to the dashes and dodges we perform with the dual blades. You also have Stun Resistance at level 3, and finally Speed Sharpening at level 3. So that is the budget dual blade build I recommend. Of course, if you don't like Latent Power, then this build may not work for you, but in Monster Hunter Rise, Latent Power is actually quite good, given how the flow of gameplay works. But every build out there has pros and cons. The biggest pro for this build is its potential high damage output, thanks to having Latent Power. On top of that, the next pro is that this build has stamina management skills. Constitution, coupled with the stamina depletion that Latent Power gives us, means that we can stay in demon mode for longer periods. And on top of that, this build once again can be used against any monster because it focuses on raw attack rather than anything else. But unfortunately there are cons. One of the biggest cons for this build is you need Latent Power to be active for optimal damage output. And finally, the other con is, unfortunately, Crit Boost decorations are tough to get, especially if you're just going through the story. But if you're looking for a build to get you through the game, and allow you to start farming the endgame, I'd strongly recommend this one. Even at endgame, this build is incredibly powerful thanks to latent power and should serve you well. So there we have it, those are some of the builds that I like to use for the dual blades. Now these builds aim to be general builds, able to take on pretty much any task in Monster Hunter Rise. They may also differ slightly from some of the other meta builds found in the community. They also can be different depending on what talismans you have available to you. But regardless, these are builds that I personally like to use, and I hope they help you out in your hunts. So until next time, I've been Darcblade, bringing you some amazing builds for the dual blades in Monster Hunter Rise. Hope you enjoyed the video, thanks for watching, subscribe and like for more.